We have a real-time stress test of these numbers right now, and in terms of moving the needle, the anti-vaxxers actually appear to be winning. As a recent BuzzFeed news article shows, they're doing so by leveraging the digital tools that enable scary misrepresentations of data to go viral, like claims that unvaccinated women's menstrual cycles, fertility, and even pregnancies can be negatively impacted via some kind of magical contagion from women or men who've been vaccinated, or confusion about the statistical risks of blood clots, and even fear-mongering about covered-up deaths. Once any of these false claims is believed by someone who was sitting on the fence, it can become very difficult to overcome the visceral emotional conviction that the vaccines must be dangerous and the truth is being hidden. So my question is, might it be possible to immunize people from this kind of misinformation? I know there's no easy answer to this, but I'm a big fan of the idea that the more we model lucid reasoning in the world, the more we inject certain key principles into the discourse, the more we increase the likelihood of people coming into contact with good sense-making in ways that, every now and again, will illuminate the bulb over the head of someone ready to pop. So, if you know someone like that, here are 3 quick principles. The first is the law of large numbers. So, though it has happened before, it is unusual to have a globally shared experience like the one we're going through with the pandemic, with millions of people getting vaccinated, if they're lucky, all at once. The larger the numbers get in any data set, the higher the likelihood for really low probability occurrences. The recent incidence of blood clots is an excellent example. With the AstraZeneca vaccine, the incidence has been slightly higher than 1 per 100,000. That's too high, but the good news is that it is treatable, and doctors now have identified it and know how to recognize the symptoms. With the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the blood clot incidence has been at around 2 per million. Now think of it this way. Roughly 1 in 11 million plane flights end in a crash, which means it is extremely rare to have been in a plane crash. But the law of large numbers says that if you gather data on a large enough group of people, you will inevitably then find a significant number who've had the experience of being in a crash. This doesn't increase the risks of air travel for any individual, but it may increase an amplified perception of that risk. Now, the fact is, if you look at the numbers, you are 100 times more likely to die in a car accident than a plane crash. But of course, way more people are terrified of flying than of driving. We're not intuitively good at large numbers. So here's the important context-creating statistic. The incidence of blood clots from COVID infection is around 16%. That's 16,000 per 100,000 and 160,000 per million, as compared to the risk of 1 in 100,000 for AstraZeneca and 2 per million for Johnson & Johnson. The second principle is correlation versus causation and anecdotes versus evidence. These two are related and they're fairly quick distinctions I want to make. Simply stated, the plural of anecdote is not evidence. Anecdotes are not an endpoint of scientific inquiry, but they can be a good place to start. All stories, no matter how many, gathered from the wild about scary side effects that have not been subjected to careful analysis are still anecdotes. They do not add up to evidence, though they may indicate the need for further research. In one sense, they illustrate the law of large numbers that we were just talking about, but beyond that, they're just stories, without any guardrails on verifying important details and causal relationships. Correlation is not causation means that the fact that I kissed my wedding ring right before buying the winning lottery ticket, for example, does not mean that this caused me to win. By the same token, getting vaccinated and later dying of liver failure or developing a rare disorder may in fact be causally unrelated, even though the correlation can seem like a slam dunk. Likewise, your common cold almost certainly would have resolved itself whether or not you were megadosing on echinacea. And third, the background rate. One very important question when looking at the incidence of certain new conditions in trial groups for any kind of medical research is the background rate. This means the number of people in the general population who develop certain conditions anyway, regardless of whether or not they are in a trial group for a drug. Comparing the incidence of something like Bell's palsy in vaccine recipients both to the placebo group and to the background rate in the population is an important part of making sense of trial data. In trials for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, 8 cases of Bell's palsy were reported, one of which was in the placebo group. And this turned out to be at or lower than the background rate. The background rate gives us a way of grasping that people are inevitably going to develop various conditions for a host of genetic and environmental reasons that may have nothing to do with the vaccine having been administered. This means rare and scary medical events and conditions will inevitably be present when the numbers of people involved get big enough. This doesn't mean researchers assume no causal connection. It means more analysis and perhaps further research is necessary to determine whether or not it is there. In the case of Bell's palsy, a causal relationship turned out not to be there. But in the case of the rare blood clotting disorder, a causal relationship was, in fact, established. So, my hope is that with friends and family who are perhaps on the fence or have been scared into hesitancy, introducing them to these concepts or introducing these concepts into your conversations might be helpful. And I think that the important thing to remember is they actually describe a kind of cognitive blind spot that we are all prone to until we are otherwise educated.